I also want the world to see Palestinians beyond this moment and beyond even this century, and to understand that the trajectory of time, the contributions of Palestinians to civilization is far more stunning and important and beautiful.
Wafa Ghnaim is a Palestinian dress historian, researcher, author, curator, and educator who began learning embroidery from her mother, award-winning artist Feryal Abbasi-Ghnaim, when she was 2 years old. She founded the Tatreez Institute in 2016 and is currently the curator of the Museum of the Palestinian People in Washington, D.C., and a research scholar at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art. Welcome, Wafa.
Thank you.
In 2016, as I just said, you founded the Tatreez Institute, also known as Tatreez Tea, to, quote, preserve, document, and research Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese, and Jordanian embroidery, dress, and history from the diaspora. Committed to safeguarding intangible cultural heritage and preventing cultural erasure. So I want to unpack each one of those parts with a few questions. But first, the love of Tatreez began early in your life at the feet of your mother. Your mom, Feryal Abbasi-Ghnaim, is one of the world's experts on Tatreez and how Palestinian embroidery tells a host of stories, a collective memory. Say a word about your mom, Wafa.
Well, I've so much of my work at the Tatreez Institute, even my book, where all of this my whole work kind of stemmed from and was birthed from, was from the book Tatreez Tea, which was really meant to document the oral history she passed to me and my sisters at a young age. So I want to always ensure that lineage is connected, because my mother's work for so many decades was unpaid, sort of thankless work that she did in the United States when she first immigrated. And, not only is it an important practice in an indigenous community like the Palestinians and in indigenous culture as a whole to maintain lineage of knowledge, it's also in gratitude to what she's done, because if I didn't learn from her and I, didn't have all these years of essentially apprenticing under her, I would not have had the opportunity to then teach or pass on that knowledge to the next generation of Palestinians in diaspora.
And you have students yourselves, then, the next generation in this lineage.
Exactly. Some of them are my age, some of them are older. I've taught embroidery to Palestinians who are my elder. There would be like my aunties, my khaltos. And that has been a great privilege, because that is a true, it's always an exchange of knowledge with students, but they have a different sort of breadth of understanding of the culture that they contribute even to me and my growth, and I'm their student in so many ways as well. But then there's, the younger generation, those that are coming after me, that this will be in their hands after I pass and after we all move on, and that's ultimately who I have my eye on.
If people want to learn a little bit more about your mom, I was reading about her earlier today at the Tatreez Institute or Tatreez Tea website, and you have a whole link to your mom's sort of mini biography there. Fascinating, and really a beautiful and powerful and strong woman.
Yeah, she's, I was most inspired. I've always been inspired by my mother, and so that's where so much of my gratitude comes from. But I was very proud in 2018 when she received the National Endowment for the Arts Heritage Fellowship, which is like this once in a lifetime honor. And she was the first Palestinian born in Palestine before 1948 to receive it. There was a recipient before that who was born in Israel, or occupied Palestine. But she's the first Palestinian woman as well to have been honored in the award. And the reason that means so much to me and why I want to mention it in this interview is because in that same cohort, there were many artists being honored, and the National Endowment of the Arts has a long history of honoring artists that have been persecuted or oppressed or are in some way being marginalized by the current government. So at the time she received the award, it was under the first Trump administration.
Oh, wow.
To have her on stage speaking about her work and like the culmination of her career in such a huge venue that the NEA provides was immensely powerful. And that very year was the year I actually released the print version of Tatreez Tea.
Really?
2018. Yeah, 2016 is when I wrote it and released it in a digital format, and then I expanded it by 2018 and it released the same year. So for her, that was such a big big moment for her. Yeah.
Proud for herself and what she brought to this collective memory, but then the joy and the pride of the next generation, and then her legacy in her daughter.
And all of her daughters.
And all of...
My two sisters, me, and also her grandchildren. We were all able to join her on stage in Washington, D.C. It was such a big deal. And, you know, again, after so many decades of her tirelessly teaching Palestinian embroidery in the United States, as an immigrant, English was her second language.
In the background, probably.
In the background, at folk festivals and these sort of like obscure venues, to be asked questions about a whole host of things that have nothing to do with her specialty in embroidery and dressmaking throughout the years, to try to protect our little ears from the types of questions that people would ask when they would come to her booth. Oh, terrorism, and oh this and oh that, things that had nothing to do really with what she was attempting to present. You know, to find and to not be compensated, by the way, for any of this. She really, I think, sacrificed so much, and maybe not sacrifice in a way where she lost something, because I know that I know this work really meant a lot to her, and this is the fruit of her life. But in a sense, she did sacrifice because, you know, she didn't pursue a career. You know, this was her life's work. So back to Tatreez Tea. Years ago, before my Palestinian activism, I was deeply involved in a group in St. Louis called Friends of Tibet. So I'm very attuned to the desire that you have in Tatreez Tea to preserve and document Palestinian, Syrian, Lebanese, and Jordanian embroidery and dress. Talk to us about that part of your work, the preservation and documentation, and if you want to fold in your work at the Smithsonian and the Met, do that too. Well, at the inception of Tatreez Tea, before I called it the Tatreez Institute, it was totally an educational initiative. I was just out there teaching Palestinian embroidery. 2016, that was the time nobody was teaching Palestinian embroidery. Today we see people popping up teaching it in their local communities. That was the whole purpose of that initial phase of Tatreez Tea, was to create culture bearers in their communities, Palestinian culture bearers that could then teach their community and the next generation, right? Because I don't want to be the one traveling the world teaching all the time. I wanted the community to get involved. When I felt that was achieved, essentially the pandemic hit, right, in 2019, 2020, and I then was one of the first folks doing virtual classes, the only one doing Palestinian embroidery virtual classes at the time, but that's how the Smithsonian, I'd been teaching in person, so I told them, why don't I show you how I do my virtual classes, and then maybe we can teach this online. So I started teaching Tatreez Tea classes, Tatreez Institute, and Smithsonian, and that went virtual. And these were like the first kind of platforms where craft and art was being taught virtually, And I was teaching a lot. I was teaching maybe 8 to 10 classes a week.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I was teaching morning, noon, night. I was teaching after my son went to bed. I was teaching on the weekends. I was teaching all the time. I taught thousands of people, I'm telling you. thousands of people all around the world. And then towards the end of the pandemic, I was exhausted. I had nothing left to give. And so I had a lot to give, but it was like teaching and public speaking was where
it wears you.
It wears on you, exactly. And so sort of my energy I felt was best spent documenting the lessons I had taught. So I took a page out of my mother's book, so to speak, and that, I decided I'm going to write some of this so that it's accessible to people beyond those attending my classes. And that's where I turned more into research, and that's where the Met came in, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They began to acknowledge the important contributions I was making to the collection that they had on the Palestinian dress collection that they stewarded and the Syrian dress collection that they stewarded. Because I was able to decipher what was Palestinian, what was Syrian, and their record keeping was, like many museums, not very clear. I mean, they didn't have Palestinian curators or Syrian curators, and then that's where I applied for the fellowship, and I was awarded that opportunity.
Did you host exhibits, or were you basically working with their collection and just deciphering and labeling? Tell just a little bit more about your work at the Met.
Yeah, so the way the research fellowships work is you propose a project, and the grants committee decides if they want to fund your project or not. The project I proposed was in part to identify the collections that they had, so to update their archival records. What did they have? Where did it come from?
Gotcha.
What does it mean? And what are the appropriate terms to attribute geographically to this? And cultural terms as well. The other part of the project was to explore headdresses and the lineage of the Palestinian headdresses they had in the collection. And that's where towards the summer and sort of the end of the fellowship, I moved into the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art, because they housed a collection of ancient objects that were sculptures and funerary reliefs of women from the region in the centuries prior wearing headdresses. So I could come in and, they're of course interested in ancient Near East. This is a discipline. I'm a visiting scholar. I'm not an ancient, art scholar at all. And as a visiting scholar, they had context on who the women were. I was asking what they were wearing. And I was trying to create a trajectory of time in which the headdress evolved and how it became what it was by the 20th century.
So you haven't, tell me if I'm right, you have an expertise not only in identifying place, but period.
Yes, exactly. So place and period, time period, exactly, yeah. Oh, and just to be sure, absolutely no exhibition development. That in a research fellowship, it's primarily they're there to support you to get to your next phase in your career in research and writing. And so I'm in the process of publication for a number of the conclusions I reached in the research.
I see. This is a little bit longer of a question, but you'll get the gist of it. I've been saying for the last year and a half that the genocide in Gaza and in occupied Palestine is not simply a war on Gaza, or even only, and it's bad enough, but even on Palestinian people. I've been saying it's an attempt to erase Palestinian culture and even memory of Palestine from human memory. So like you, Wafa, I'm very concerned about cultural appropriation and cultural erasure. Everything from the so-called, hummus wars, Zionists saying that hummus and falafel and other pieces of Palestinian cuisine are really Israeli, to your work in dress and fabric and art history. So last year you wrote an article about an experience of this kind of cultural erasure, cultural appropriation, about a visit to the Brooklyn Museum in October of 2023.
October 7th.
Yeah. You wrote it last year. It was published, at least the article I read in 2024. But some of the ways that this one dress or a couple dresses were labeled were Bedouin or Middle Eastern or Holy Land or Ottoman, Syria or whatever. talk about that experience and your work in undoing this cultural erasure that you talked about. Because it's a real it's a real thing. It's a problem.
Yeah, and I think that, just to begin, I think
It's
that
diabolical.
it is. And I think so much of embroidery and dressmaking, Palestinian embroidery and dressmaking, is focused on preserving cultural heritage, but it's also in part to prevent cultural erasure, as long as we know what is correct and what is incorrect. And misinformation has been propagated primarily when we're talking about like the history of museum collections and dress collections in museums. We're talking about collections that stem from the late 19th, early 20th century, times when the Holy Land pilgrimage was very popular, and this whole idea of like visit the Holy Land, and this is all, and Palestinian identity, Palestinian people were considered
props on the stage.
Props.
Forgive me for
Extras.
interrupting, but
No, absolutely. And they were, even in the photography of the time, even that's cataloged at the Library of Congress in the Matson collection, we see them depicted as biblical caricatures, without names, without places. And actually, this is something Edward Said talks about in The Last Sky. He talks about how namelessness, placelessness is a condition of exile, even in the photography. And I find that to be true with the dresses as well. There's no name attributed to, there's no maker's name. There's a donor's name. There's this American or European name or Jewish name associated with the dress, and no other name. We don't know who the maker is. We don't know where it was purchased or its lineage. We just know this other person is being honored for it that donated it. And I find that fundamentally unethical. I find that to be actually immoral in terms of the stewardship of a collection, and especially of indigenous people. So fortunately, places like the Met, who funded me, they were like, tell us what this is. And in terms of the Brooklyn Museum, when I approached them after I saw that dress, the destiny of that moment, showing up to the museum, not understanding exactly what was happening quite yet. It was the morning of October 7th, and the news was still trickling in, and I think we were all really shocked. We didn't know what we were hearing yet. And still making it. I went to see Africa Fashion, this like incredible, and it talks about dress and fashion of the continent of Africa, post-colonialism to today. So very relevant. I was interested in how they depicted that, because I'd like to know, what does freedom look like in dress for Palestinians? How can I imagine this? When we walked in and saw the dress from Gaza, it wasn't from El Khalil, it wasn't from Bethlehem, it wasn't from Ramallah. These are places. Think about the Holy Land pilgrimage. Usually museums have Bethlehem dress, Jerusalem dress, or Ramallah dress. Those are the ones they have. They had a Gaza dress. And Brooklyn Museum, I have to say, their attribution was closer to the truth than what I've seen. I've seen other museums call them Syrian, Bedouin, Mohammedan, weird, obscure attributions, Free State, I've seen. That was at the Met.
Wow.
2 of the objects were attributed geographically to Free State, yeah. But with the Brooklyn Museum, they had Palestine/Israel. And then they had a statement about Rashida Tlaib being sworn into Congress and wearing a thobe. So I was like, well, this isn't what they're looking at. And it was defiled caption, and I contacted the curator immediately. She was very responsive. Very open. Good. Yes, and so I have to give credit where credit is due. Brooklyn Museum really showed up. They let me have full access to the collections, unlimited publishing of what I was researching. They updated the caption immediately, and now there's actually a new dress on display. And the caption written for that is based on the work I provided them, and rewritten and slightly for that dress by another Palestinian who is the curatorial assistant for that collection now. So I'm just very delighted to see that's what the impact that one label can have, and that's what I was trying to say in that article.
I'm glad that they were so responsive. It makes you, though, wonder that, right? That's one museum out of how many museums in this country and around the world.
Yeah.
And don't you wish there were like 1,000 of you able to just travel around and just do this kind of work? But have you found that it's more ignorance than intentional I'm sure that there are some places where this is an intentional erasure, cultural erasure, but it sounds like this was just ignorance on the part of the museum curators.
I think it's ignorance. I think it's sloppy record keeping, which is something that the current generation of many museum staffs are grappling with. I think there's issues when they went from paper cataloging to digital cataloging, because I'm recalling one museum that it was a Palestinian dress that was properly attributed, and then when it was transferred to digital, it was noted as it was something completely different.
Oh, wow.
And it looks like a total typo. Like everything else was perfectly transcribed from the paper file, except for the country. It was like the Philippines, or I forgot, it was another P country. So it's like, I think it's something to do with that. But I also have to say, and this is, I think, met with a lot more resistance from the museum world that don't, for obvious reasons. I think that this is the problem that museums have to face in their history as being colonialist institutions, that they attempted for a period of time in the 20th century to maintain neutrality. And so that's where you get things like Palestine / Israel, or you get Free State, or you get Bedouin, because that was the most, depending on the era that was cataloged in, that dress is cataloged in, that was the most appropriate term to use at the time according to American foreign policy. And that's how they viewed neutrality. So that's why you get in the same museum many different attributions that are not Palestinian, because they were donated in different eras of what was considered neutral, and that terminology changed. And this I find very fascinating. But we're also just talking about European and American collections. There are also Palestinian-led collections. There's also Israeli collections. And those are all different animals.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say something about museum funders, and that might have an impact on the way the displays are labeled.
I mean, I think I think the displays are labeled based on what's in the catalog, what's in the archival record. The archival record is researched by staff that the boards and trustees have hired and approve of, and that traditional academia has trained. And so that, I think that all connects. I don't think it's quite as direct, but I do see museums attempting to correct. The way that I proceed in my work is that I'm attempting to achieve the highest degree of accuracy in record keeping. And that to me is the most important thing. I'm not coming in to claim something's Palestinian that's not. And I'm also, there were many pieces in the Met's collection that I said those aren't Palestinian. I said they're actually these, I've researched them and found that they were from other areas, and the curator accepted. So it's about accuracy to me.
I read a statement that Tatreez is informative as well as decorative. And so I know this. I don't know how to do it, but I know that it is a thing, and you and I talked about just briefly earlier. Experts can look at a thobe dress and tell you exactly what village or city it's from, who it was made for what occasion, even the time period. Can you give us at least an example or two? I know it has to do with design and fabric and, the kind of embroidery and color, but I mean, can you give us a specific example or two?
Yeah, I think one example might be more than enough. There is a dress in which dress do I pick? The British Museum has a dress. If you were to search it on their online collection and just look up Palestinian dress or Palestine dress, it would come up. It's from Mejdel, from historic Gaza region. And the way we know it, it's one of my favorite dresses, is that if you look closely on the threads, they're silk threads. 100%. There's no evidence of cotton threads. You can tell it's silk because it's shiny. Silk thread is silk thread. And it's silk thread, but it looks like it's dyed with synthetic dyes. So this means there's no chance it's any earlier than 1855, because that's when synthetic dyes were produced, it's 1855. In Europe, that's when they were invented. So it rapidly came into Palestine. So we're thinking probably somewhere in the late 19th century, based on the fact that it's synthetic dyes and it's silk. It can't be too much later than the late 19th century, because cotton thread, pre-dyed cotton thread, came in the late 1920s in Palestine. So it's possible she preserved the silk threads and stitched them later, but then when you look at the fabric, it looks like late 19th hand-woven, hand-dyed linen fabric. It also looks like she wore it throughout her whole life. There's clear wear and tear, which is very rare for museum collections. Always have these unworn versions, ceremonial dresses. Mm-hmm. This one was clearly worn. And by the way, the synthetic red dye was like so vibrant, and it's red and orange and brick red and all these different shades of red. It's like incredible, the palette she used, monochromatic palette she used on this, because it's all shades of red and dark red orange, right? If you look at the symbols in the dress, they're purely Gaza. I mean, they have the chevrons, the arch, the emulets that are triangular. The composition of those motifs are 100% Gaza. They're typical Gaza for that time, before 1948. So kind of piecing together all of that and then looking at the actual wear and tear of the dress, you see that on the aerial view of the dress, this is the part of the stomach is stretched out. And underneath the chest panel, or where there's the arch, it looks like there are patches placed. So she clearly had it open for breastfeeding. So this woman made it, wore it, then got married, evidently, and pregnant, and then had the baby, breastfed it, and then patched it up again. Patched it up again, by the way, with other thread with the same colors to cover that, whatever happened there where she patched it up, and then continued to wear it. So you can see a whole two lives. I mean, you see a baby's life too in that dress, and all of this tells you, it's all evidence and clues into who this maker was, even if we don't know her name. Clearly she was known for wearing this dress. Everyone knew her for this dress.
I'm sitting here just fascinated with that story.
Yeah.
Just as every thobe tells a story, it's a little off the subject, but talk to us about the symbolism of the keffiyeh.
In what context?
In Palestine, in the Palestinian world,
like contemporary.
Yeah. Or if you want to give a little bit of a history, do that as well.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of interest in the keffiyeh now, so I completely understand that. Before the 1930s, before the Palestinian riots or the Arab revolt in 1936 to 1939, the black and white keffiyeh, and also all of the different colors of keffiyehs, were only worn by Bedouin men. Not even village men, not city men, Bedouin men. That was there was like a whole social status involved, because, you know, Americans and Europeans, they love to talk about women and their headdresses and why they're veiled, but men have also had headdresses too. There's just far less of a fascination with the male body than there is with the female body. During the riots, which occurred during the British Mandate, the British occupation of Palestine, and, you know, these protests were to fight back against this idea of a Jewish state being created. I mean, by then it was very clear, everyone knew what was happening. There was an influx of Jewish immigration, everything was sort of clearly laid out by then. So Palestinian men decided to protest. Economically, like shutting down the shops and so forth. British soldiers had their British uniforms. So Palestinian men use the kufiya and to wrap around their head or around their neck during the rides. And then that's sort of when it expanded beyond Bedouin men. Now, Fallahi men or villager men, all men, Palestinian men, were now wearing the kufiya. If you fast forward to the 1960s, that's when Layla Khalid, huge activist, I'm sure your viewers know who she is, she decided to wear it on her head. And this was a very feminist move because she wasn't like a woman who wore a headscarf, but she took the kufiya, a male cloth, and put it on in the style that women covered their hair. And just in that very simple move, she sort of universalized the kufiya as something for men and women to wear in the context of resistance and freedom fighting and that kind of a thing.
At the Calandia checkpoint between Jerusalem and Ramallah, there's this big mural on the side of the apartheid wall with Layla Khalid with the kufiya.
Yeah, that famous
famous, yeah,
picture.
right?
And she's carrying a gun or something like this. Yes. Yeah, she's an iconic symbol. She has to be acknowledged. I mean, Yasser Arafat also needs to be acknowledged for during the same time, during the 1960s and 70s, he was appearing on television in his sunglasses and his kufiya folded in the shape of Palestine, right? In that triangular form. And he wore it on his head and he always said, I folded it in the shape of Palestine. He was wearing sunglasses. I mean, he was a celebrity at the time. And so he also popularized the kufiya. But then sort of it grew from there. And I think that, it's remained, since.
You've mentioned a couple of times headdresses, and that's part of your expertise as well. So maybe this is a two-part question, but say a word about headdresses. And also, do you do any work with traditional Palestinian jewelry, women's jewelry? And so anyway, that's kind of the follow-up question.
Yeah, I'm most interested with the headdresses that, because cultural material doesn't survive very long. I mean, unless they were mummified, which we do have some examples of. The headdresses carried a lot of value, monetarily, but also familially, in terms of the lineage that was presented on the headdress. So much of kind of tracing the lineage of a headdress involves interacting with in an interdisciplinary way in the art history field. And that's how I ended up again in the ancient Near East, where they had funerary sculptures of women with headdresses from the region. And the one thing that I think is the most interesting to me is that this cylindrical, flat top, coin-lined or medallion-lined, because coinage didn't always exist, but the silver, gold, jewels kind of on headdresses have existed for centuries. They meant in a social function. They haven't always only been worn by women. But the tarbush was also cylindrical, flat top headdress, and that was for a man. So we have gendered ones by the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Like one's for men, one's for women. But if you were to really trace it back, it looks like these headdresses were worn by both men and women, even deities, and that it reflected like a social status in that regard, like a crown would. And so it does exist in a similar form and meaning since the ancient period.
But not for peasants. I mean, you said it reflects a certain social class and income level, or?
I don't know if income level is right, but there's a sort of a societal status that you'd hold. So yeah, it might be more in a ritual context or in the belief systems of the time. I have nothing to do with monetary value because that was invented at some point as well. But that there was some importance to the wearer. and it might not have always been, it doesn't seem that it was just for women, but that there was also regional styles, but the regions were bigger. So by the 20th century, we see Bethlehem had a headdress and Ramallah had a headdress, blah, blah, blah. If you go to, and all the other, etc., I should say, if you go back into the ancient period, or even the 1st and 2nd century CE, you see that the regions were much bigger. So like Palmyra had headdress, right? Palmyra, but that region was much bigger, right? Canaanites had their headdresses, but that region was much bigger, you know. So the regional delineations like changed and all that kind of stuff changed, but the concept remained the same. And so I find that really interesting. There's not a lot of research in this. I have to tell you, some of my elders in the Palestinian like dress community don't agree that this is like a valid investigation, but I feel that it is. I'm finding a lot of evidence and a lot of questions unanswered. I have a lot of unanswered questions, and usually that means I won't let it go until I answer the questions.
One last question.
Yes.
We've titled your talk here, Tatreez, Palestinian Embroidery, Storytelling, and Resistance. Do you understand, or how do you understand, what you do? This preservation, this documentation, but also your work against cultural erasure and appropriation. Do you understand that as a form of your own personal resistance to occupation, oppression, the Israeli affliction of this ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people?
I do, always. But I look forward to the day that I can be just like any one of my other colleagues focusing on dress history, where I'm just a dress historian, just like them. And that, you know, my work and my body, our history, isn't politicized. I don't want to define the entirety of our dress and even our cultural heritage, but more broadly, like the art history of the region. I don't want it only defined within the context of the occupation. And so I am resisting, and I do believe in preserving cultural heritage, preventing cultural erasure, and an end to this occupation. But I also want the world to see Palestinians beyond this moment and beyond even this century, and to understand that this is the trajectory of time, the contributions of Palestinians to civilization is far more stunning and important and beautiful.
You know, that was an important insight and reminder to me that Palestine can stand on its own and not be defined by referring to Israel. That Palestine is independent and strong and beautiful in and of itself, and doesn't have to be over against the occupier.
Yeah.
And sometimes we in the West forget that about not only Palestine but other indigenous populations who are oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that comment very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I completely agree. I think otherwise we get cornered intellectually. And then we stop imagining who we are and who we can be.
Wafa Ghnaim, thank you.
Thank you for having me.